My sister humiliated me at a luxury resort. Now my family is falling apart. Helen Walker stood in her Chicago apartment, gazing into the full-length mirror. Her suitcase sat packed and zipped beside her, ready for the annual family Thanksgiving trip. She had always been meticulous about preparation, lists, double checks, and a calm efficiency that reflected her professional life as a research director at a major pharmaceutical company. She adjusted the lapel of her simple yet elegant navy blazer, smoothing out the fabric. At 33, she had achieved the life she always wanted. A six-figure salary, a high-rise apartment with a stunning view of Lake Michigan, and a sense of independence she had worked tirelessly to earn. Yet, despite her achievements, there was one arena of life that never failed to unsettle her: her family. Helen's parents, George and Margaret, had retired to Florida, enjoying the benefits of a lifestyle funded largely by her grandfather. Her sister, Catherine, lived an Instagram-worthy existence: designer bags, luxury vacations, a daughter dressed in expensive outfits, all financed by the same source. Helen, in contrast, had carved her life out of sheer determination. Scholarships funded her education, and part-time jobs paid for her living expenses. Her family's favoritism toward Catherine, the golden child, had been a painful reality since childhood. Yet, she had long stopped trying to earn their approval. The phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. Catherine's name flashed on the screen, accompanied by the ringtone Helen had set for her, a generic chime she didn't bother personalizing. Helen hesitated before answering. "Catherine," she greeted coolly. "Oh, Helen, I hope you're ready for tomorrow," Catherine said, her voice dripping with the practiced warmth she reserved for public appearances. "The Breakers is stunning this year. Mom and Dad are already here, and we've got everything planned. Thanksgiving dinner, a spa day, and some great photos for social media, of course." Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll see you there," she replied, ignoring the subtle jab about appearances. As Catherine continued talking about her plans, Helen found her thoughts drifting. Every year, these family gatherings felt less like reunions and more like performances. The extravagant settings, the curated photos, the air of perfection, it was all a facade. Beneath it lay tension, competition, and unspoken resentments. "I have to go," Helen said abruptly, cutting Catherine off mid-sentence. She didn't wait for a reply before ending the call. With a sigh, Helen looked out at the city skyline, her grandfather's words echoing in her mind: "Become someone who can stand on their own feet. Dignity is more valuable than wealth." For as long as she could remember, her grandfather had been the only family member who truly understood her. He was a self-made man, having built a construction empire from the ground up. His wealth supported the rest of the family, but his respect was something Helen valued far more. Pulling on her coat, Helen picked up her suitcase and headed out the door. As she stepped into the taxi, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this year's Thanksgiving would be different. Helen arrived at the Breakers under a brilliant Florida sun. The Italian Renaissance architecture of the luxury resort gleamed in the light, a symbol of opulence and history. Guests in designer attire strolled through the marble-floored lobby, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Dragging her navy suitcase behind her, Helen felt a twinge of anxiety. She had dealt with her family's antics for years, but something about this trip felt off. At the front desk, a young receptionist greeted her with a polite smile. "Welcome to the Breakers. May I have your name, please?" "Helen Walker," she replied. The receptionist's fingers danced across the keyboard. After a moment, her smile faltered. "I'm sorry, Ms. Walker, but I can't seem to find your reservation." Helen frowned. There must be a mistake. I'm with the Walker family. The receptionist glanced nervously at the screen, then at Helen. I see reservations for Mr. and Mrs. Walker and Ms. Catherine Walker, but... The sound of heels clicking against the marble interrupted them. Catherine appeared, her designer bag swinging on her arm and a triumphant smile on her face. "Oh, Helen, there you are." Helen turned to face her sister, whose tone was just a little too cheerful. "What's going on?" Catherine shrugged, feigning innocence. "I only made reservations for the real family: Mom, Dad, my husband, and Amy. You know, the ones who matter." For a moment, the words hung in the air, cutting deeper than Catherine's rehearsed smirk. Helen felt a surge of anger but quickly quelled it. She had long learned not to give her sister the satisfaction of a reaction. "I see," Helen said evenly, gripping the handle of her suitcase. "Then I'll leave." Her calm tone seemed to catch Catherine off guard. "Wait, Helen, I didn't mean..." But Helen had already turned away. She walked toward the entrance, ignoring the sympathetic glances of the front desk staff and the stunned silence from her parents, who had been watching from a distance. Outside, the sunlight felt brighter, the air fresher. Helen hailed a taxi, her mind racing. Years of pent-up frustration threatened to spill over, but instead, a strange sense of liberation took hold. As the car pulled away from the resort, Helen opened her phone and dialed the one person she knew would understand. "Grandfather," she said when he answered. "Helen, what's wrong?" Her voice was steady as she recounted the events at the hotel. On the other end of the line, she could hear her grandfather's breathing grow heavier, a sign of his barely contained anger. "I'll handle this," he said finally, his tone resolute. "Leave it to me." As Helen ended the call, she leaned back in the taxi seat, letting the tension drain from her body. For the first time in years, she felt free. The next morning, Helen awoke to the sound of her phone vibrating incessantly on the nightstand. She reached over groggily, squinting at the screen. It was a message from her grandfather. "Come to the estate. Let's have our own Thanksgiving." Beneath the message was an address. Helen immediately recognized it. Her grandfather's private estate, a sprawling property in the hills of Asheville, North Carolina. Her heart lifted. Spending time with her grandfather sounded infinitely more appealing than enduring another suffocating dinner with her parents and Catherine. Helen wasted no time packing her things. She booked a flight to Asheville, the weight of her family's rejection fading with each mile she traveled. Hours later, Helen stood in front of the estate's grand iron gates. Beyond them, the driveway curved up toward a massive stone mansion surrounded by autumn foliage. It was a scene straight out of a postcard. As she walked up the cobblestone path, the door opened and her grandfather, Richard Walker, stepped out to greet her. Though his hair was silver and his frame slightly stooped with age, he exuded the same commanding presence Helen had admired since childhood. "Helen," he said warmly, enveloping her in a hug. "I'm glad you came." "Me too," she replied, feeling a surge of gratitude. He led her inside, where the smell of freshly baked bread and roasted turkey filled the air. The estate's interior was just as impressive as the exterior: vaulted ceilings, intricate woodwork, and a roaring fireplace in the grand hall. As they settled in the dining room, Helen noticed a second-place setting at the long mahogany table. "Are we expecting someone else?" she asked. Richard smiled enigmatically. "You'll see." Before she could press further, the sound of a car pulling up outside caught her attention. Moments later, the front door opened and a tall man in his mid-30s walked in. Helen recognized him instantly. Ethan Carter, a lawyer who had worked with her grandfather for years. She had met him once before at a family gathering, though they hadn't exchanged more than a few words. "Ethan." Richard greeted him with a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Ethan nodded, his gaze briefly meeting Helen's. "Of course. It's always a pleasure." Helen felt a flicker of curiosity. What was Ethan doing here? As they sat down to dinner, the conversation flowed easily. Richard shared stories from his youth, regaling them with tales of his early days in business. Ethan chimed in with his own anecdotes, his dry humor catching Helen off guard. For the first time in years, Helen felt truly at ease. There were no veiled criticisms, no passive-aggressive remarks, just genuine connection. After dinner, Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression turning serious. "Helen, there's something I need to tell you." She straightened, sensing the shift in tone. "You've always been the most capable and independent of the family," he began. "You've built a life for yourself without relying on anyone else. That's why I've decided to make you the primary beneficiary of my estate." Helen's eyes widened. "What?" Richard held up a hand to silence her. "This isn't about favoritism or punishment. It's about rewarding integrity and hard work. I've spent my life building something I'm proud of, and I want to leave it to someone who will honor that legacy." The weight of his words settled over her. She opened her mouth to protest, but Ethan spoke first. "Your grandfather's decision isn't just about inheritance, Helen," he said, his tone measured. "He wants you to take on a leadership role in the family business, to carry on his vision." Helen's mind raced. She had always admired her grandfather's work ethic and values, but the idea of stepping into his shoes was overwhelming. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted. Richard smiled gently. "You don't have to decide now. But I want you to think about it. Take the time you need." As the evening wore on, Helen found herself lost in thought. The idea of inheriting her grandfather's legacy was daunting, but it also felt like an opportunity to finally step out of her family's shadow. Later that night, as she sat by the fireplace with a glass of wine, Ethan joined her. "It's a lot to take in, isn't it?" he said, sitting in the armchair opposite hers. She nodded. "I never expected this. My whole life, I've been trying to prove myself to my family, and now, this feels like more than I deserve." Ethan's expression softened. "You've earned this, Helen. Your grandfather sees something in you that no one else in your family does. Trust his judgment." His words gave her pause. For years, she had fought to prove her worth, but perhaps it was time to stop fighting and start believing in herself. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Helen made a silent vow. She would take this chance, not just for herself, but for the man who had always believed in her. The next morning, Helen woke to the soft light streaming through the heavy velvet curtains of the guest bedroom. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind, the unexpected offer, the weight of responsibility, and the silent encouragement she saw in her grandfather's eyes. She dressed quickly, deciding to explore the estate before speaking with her grandfather again. The mansion, with its long hallways and intricate woodwork, had always fascinated her as a child. It felt like stepping back in time. Helen wandered through the corridors, her footsteps echoing softly against the hardwood floors. She passed portraits of ancestors she'd never met, their stern faces watching her as she moved. Eventually, she found herself in a room she didn't recognize. It was a library, grand and timeless, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a rolling ladder to reach the highest shelves. The scent of aged leather and parchment hung in the air. Helen ran her fingers along the spines of the books, pausing when her hand brushed against a small wooden box on one of the lower shelves. Curious, she pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a stack of faded letters tied together with a silk ribbon. The top letter was addressed to her grandfather, dated decades earlier. Richard, it began in elegant handwriting. I hope this letter finds you well. I write not as a business associate, but as an old friend. There are things about our past that I fear may resurface, and I need your discretion. Helen's brow furrowed as she read on. The letter hinted at secrets buried within the family's history, though it was vague on specifics. Enjoying the library? Helen nearly jumped at the sound of Ethan's voice. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, a slight smirk on his face. I didn't hear you come in, she said, quickly closing the box. He gestured to the letters. Find something interesting? Helen hesitated. I'm not sure yet. Do you know anything about these? Ethan crossed the room, his gaze falling on the box. Your grandfather's been collecting letters and documents for years. Some of them are related to the family business, others, well, let's just say he's always been interested in preserving history. Helen studied Ethan's expression, but it gave nothing away. You seem to know a lot about my grandfather, she said. He shrugged. We've worked closely for a long time. He trusts me, and I trust him. Helen nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ethan's relationship with her grandfather than he was letting on. Later that day, Helen joined her grandfather in his study. The room was lined with bookshelves, and a large desk sat in the center, cluttered with papers and photographs. I see you found the library, Richard said with a smile as she entered. I did. It's incredible, she replied, taking a seat across from him. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. This estate has always been more than just a home. It's a place where our family's history is preserved, both the good and the bad. Helen hesitated before asking, Grandpa, I found some letters in the library. They seemed personal. Richard's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. Ah, those. Yes, there are many things about our family's past that you don't know, Helen. Some of it is painful, but it's also what shaped us into who we are today. Is that why you want me to take on this role? She asked. Because of the past? Richard's eyes softened. Partly, but mostly it's because I believe in you. You have the strength and the vision to carry this family forward, to honor its legacy while forging your own path. Helen felt a lump rise in her throat. I don't want to let you down. You won't, Richard said firmly. But remember, this isn't just about me or the family. This is about you finding your purpose. That evening, as Helen sat by the fireplace once more, she couldn't stop thinking about the letters. They hinted at a side of her grandfather she had never seen, one filled with secrets and struggles. Ethan joined her again, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Thought you might need this, he said, handing her one. Thanks, she murmured, staring into the flames. You're still thinking about the letters, aren't you? He asked, taking a seat beside her. Helen nodded. I feel like there's so much I don't know about my family. And now with everything my grandfather wants me to do, I feel like I need to understand the past before I can move forward. Ethan sipped his coffee, his expression unreadable. Sometimes understanding the past can be more painful than you expect. But it can also give you clarity. Helen looked at him, searching for any sign of what he might be hiding. Do you know what's in those letters? Ethan hesitated before answering. I've read some of them. Your grandfather trusted me to help organize his archives, but it's not my place to tell you what's in them. That's something you'll have to discover for yourself. As the fire crackled between them, Helen made a decision. She would dig deeper into her family's history, no matter where it led. If she was going to take on the responsibility her grandfather was offering, she needed to know the whole truth, even if it meant uncovering secrets that had been buried for decades. The following morning, Helen woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The lingering mystery of the letters and her grandfather's cryptic comments had sparked a fire in her that she couldn't ignore. If she was going to take on the family legacy, she needed to understand it fully. After breakfast, she wandered the mansion again, drawn this time to the upper floors. As a child, she'd never been allowed to explore the attic. It had always been off-limits, its doors locked, and her curiosity dismissed with vague explanations about safety or clutter. Today, however, was different. Standing before the heavy wooden door at the end of the third-floor hallway, Helen noticed it was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she stepped inside and was immediately struck by the musty scent of old wood and forgotten memories. Sunlight filtered through a small, dusty window, casting golden rays over piles of trunks, crates, and antique furniture covered in white sheets. Helen's eyes swept the room, taking in the relics of a bygone era. A grandfather clock stood in one corner, its hands frozen in time. An ornate mirror leaned against the wall, its once polished surface now tarnished. Her attention was drawn to a small desk near the window, its surface cluttered with yellowed papers and faded photographs. She approached it cautiously, her heart pounding with anticipation. Among the papers, she found a leather-bound journal. The initials R.C. were embossed on the cover in gold. Flipping it open, she realized it was her grandfather's journal from decades earlier. June 12, 1965, the first entry began. I met with Gregory today. He insists the deal will secure our family's future, but I can't shake the feeling that we're stepping into something dangerous. Helen's fingers tightened around the book. The entries detailed business dealings that were far more complex and ethically questionable than she had imagined. References to the Gregory deal appeared repeatedly, often accompanied by mentions of risk, secrecy, and regret. What are you doing up here? Helen spun around to find Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. You scared me, she said, closing the journal quickly. How did you find me? I saw the door open, he replied, stepping into the room. This attic has been locked for years. What made you come up here? Helen hesitated. I've always been curious about this place. And now, I guess I'm looking for answers. Ethan's gaze fell on the journal in her hands. Did you find them? Not yet, she admitted. But I'm starting to see that there's a lot more to this family than I ever realized. Ethan crossed his arms, leaning against a nearby trunk. Your grandfather has always carried the weight of this legacy on his shoulders. He's made sacrifices and choices that most people couldn't understand. Like what? Helen pressed. He hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell her. Let's just say some of the decisions he made were necessary to protect the family and the business. But they weren't easy. Helen opened the journal again, her eyes scanning another entry. August 3rd, 1967. I can't tell Helen. She's too young to understand. But one day, she'll have to know the truth about Gregory and the others. She looked up sharply. He mentions someone named Gregory. Do you know who that is? Ethan's jaw tightened. Gregory Matheson. He was a business partner of your grandfather's. They worked together for years, but things fell apart. Why? That's not for me to say, Ethan replied, his tone firm. If you really want to know, you'll have to ask your grandfather. Later that day, Helen confronted Richard in his study. The journal was tucked under her arm as she entered the room. I found your journal, she said without preamble. Richard looked up from his desk, his expression calm but guarded. "I see you've been exploring." "You wrote about someone named Gregory Matheson," Helen continued, "and about deals you regret. What happened?" Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "Gregory and I were friends once. We built something together, something I thought would last. But greed has a way of corrupting even the best intentions." "What kind of deal was it?" Richard sighed heavily. "It was an investment, one that promised to secure the future of the business. But Gregory's methods were questionable. When I realized what was happening, it was too late to back out without jeopardizing everything. I had to make a choice: protect the family or walk away and lose everything we'd built." Helen's heart sank. "And you chose to stay." "I did," Richard admitted. "And I've spent the rest of my life trying to atone for it. That's why I've been so focused on preserving our history, on making sure our legacy isn't defined by that one mistake." Helen sat down across from him, the weight of his words settling over her. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to carry that burden," Richard said softly. "But now that you're stepping into this role, you deserve to know the truth. You have the chance to build something better, to learn from my mistakes." Helen nodded slowly, her resolve strengthening. "I want to know everything about Gregory, about the business, about our family's history. If I'm going to do this, I need to understand it all." Richard smiled faintly. "Then you're already on the right path." That night, Helen returned to the attic, determined to uncover more pieces of the puzzle. As she sifted through the boxes and papers, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows seemed to shift around her, and the faint creak of the floorboards set her on edge. But Helen pushed her fear aside. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what secrets the attic or her family's past held. As the wind howled through the cracks of the attic's old wooden frame, Helen sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by open trunks and scattered documents. The air grew colder, the dim light from the attic window barely illuminating her surroundings. Every now and then, she thought she caught the faintest sound of whispers, like distant voices carried by the wind. Among the piles of papers, she discovered a set of old photographs tucked inside an envelope labeled Matheson Agreement. The black and white images showed her grandfather and a man she'd assumed was Gregory Matheson. Gregory was tall and thin, with piercing eyes and a sleek smile that unsettled her even in the still photograph. But it wasn't just Gregory that caught her attention. It was the third man in the photographs. Standing slightly apart from the other two, his face was obscured by shadows, as though he had been deliberately erased from the frame. Helen traced her fingers over the photo, her skin prickling with unease. Who was this man, and why had her grandfather never mentioned him? The next morning, Helen confronted Richard again, this time with the photograph in hand. "Who's this?" she demanded, pointing to the shadowy figure. Richard's face paled as he took the photograph from her. For a long moment, he stared at it in silence. "That's Thomas," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas who?" Helen pressed. "Thomas Langley," Richard replied. "He was Gregory's associate, a man of questionable character." "What happened to him?" Richard hesitated, his gaze dropping to the desk. "Thomas disappeared shortly after our partnership with Gregory fell apart. No one knows what happened to him, and frankly, I didn't want to find out." Helen frowned. "You didn't think it was strange. A man just vanishes, and you let it go." "Some things are better left buried," Richard said firmly. But Helen wasn't convinced. She could see the fear in her grandfather's eyes. the way his hands trembled as he held the photograph. Whatever had happened to Thomas Langley, it was clear that Richard knew more than he was letting on. Determined to dig deeper, Helen decided to search the mansion's records for any mention of Thomas Langley. Her search led her to the library, where rows of leather-bound ledgers and handwritten journals lined the shelves. Hours passed as she combed through the dusty volumes, her fingers growing numb from turning brittle pages. Just as she was about to give up, she stumbled upon a small locked drawer built into the base of one of the bookcases. Using a bobby pin she'd hastily grabbed from her room, Helen managed to jimmy the lock open. Inside, she found a single notebook, its cover marked with the initials TL. The notebook contained entries written in a hurried, chaotic scrawl. Most of them detailed Thomas Langley's growing paranoia about Gregory Matheson and his belief that the deal they had struck was cursed. July 15, 1967, one entry read, "Gregory thinks he can control it, but he's wrong. The shadows are everywhere. They follow me, whispering, watching. I can't sleep. I can't escape." Helen's pulse quickened as she flipped through the pages. The later entries became more erratic, filled with drawings of strange symbols and fragmented sentences that made little sense. They took Gregory's wife as a warning. One note read, "I'm next. I have to leave before it's too late." Helen froze. Gregory's wife? She had never heard anyone in the family mention a wife. Her hands trembled as she read the final entry. "I know what I have to do. If the mansion burns, they'll leave us alone. This ends tonight." That night, Helen lay awake in her bed, the weight of Thomas Langley's words pressing down on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play, something her grandfather was still hiding. The shadows in her room seemed to stretch and shift, dancing across the walls in the faint moonlight. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the light. But then she heard it, the faintest whisper, so quiet it could have been mistaken for the wind. "Leave." Helen sat up abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest. She scanned the room, her eyes darting to every dark corner. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. Silence. And then, just as she was beginning to calm down, the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. "Get out." Helen's blood ran cold. She grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. Gathering her courage, Helen whispered, "What do you want?" The answer came in a voice that was barely human, low and guttural. "You don't belong here." The flashlight flickered, and Helen felt a rush of cold air sweep through the room. She bolted out of bed, her heart racing as she ran down the hall to her grandfather's room. She banged on the door until Richard opened it, his face etched with concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice groggy. "There's something in my room," Helen said, her voice trembling. "Something unnatural." Richard's expression darkened. "It started again," he muttered under his breath. "What started?" Helen demanded. Richard sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "The house, it's alive, Helen. It remembers. And now that you've started digging into the past, it won't let you stop." Helen stared at him, her fear mingling with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "The shadows, the whispers. They're all tied to what happened with Gregory and Thomas," Richard explained. "This house has secrets, Helen, secrets that don't want to be uncovered." Helen's jaw tightened. "I'm not afraid of the truth," she said, her voice firm. "You should be," Richard said grimly. "Because the truth has a way of destroying everything it touches." Helen spent the rest of the night in the library, poring over Thomas Langley's notebook by candlelight. She was too shaken to return to her room, and the warmth of the fire in the library's hearth offered some semblance of comfort. The entries became harder to decipher as she read further, the handwriting devolving into erratic loops and jagged lines. The strange symbols Thomas had drawn repeated themselves across the pages. Circles within circles, intersecting triangles, and jagged lines that resembled scratches or claw marks. Her thoughts swirled with questions. Why had Gregory Matheson's wife been taken? And what did Thomas mean about the mansion burning? As dawn broke, her exhaustion finally caught up with her. Her head drooped, and she dozed off in the library chair, the notebook still clutched in her hands. Helen woke with a start hours later to the sound of shuffling footsteps. She blinked blearily, her body stiff from sleeping upright. Richard stood in the doorway, a cup of tea in his hands. "You look like you've been through a war," he said, his voice soft. "I feel like it," Helen replied, rubbing her eyes. "I spent the night reading this." She held up Thomas's notebook. He knew something was wrong with this house. "And you knew too, didn't you?" Richard sighed heavily, setting the tea down on the table beside her. "I knew enough to stay away from it," he admitted. Thomas was a good man, but he let the darkness get to him. It consumed him, just like it did Gregory. "What happened to Gregory's wife?" Helen asked. Richard hesitated, his expression grim. "They never found her body," he said. "One night she simply vanished. Gregory claimed it was the house, that it had taken her as payment for their arrangement. But no one believed him." "And what was this arrangement?" Richard shook his head. "I don't know the details. Gregory and Thomas kept most of it to themselves. But whatever they did, it tied this house to something unnatural. Something that hasn't let go." Helen's stomach churned. She had come here searching for answers, but the truth seemed to raise more questions than it solved. Later that day, Helen decided to explore the mansion's basement. It was the one part of the house she hadn't ventured into yet, and something about it called to her. Armed with a flashlight and the growing courage of someone too deep to turn back, she made her way down the narrow staircase. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint smell of damp earth filled her nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a wide, dimly lit space. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars, tools, and strange artifacts she couldn't identify. At the far end of the room stood an iron door, rusted and covered in scratches. Her heart raced as she approached it. The door had no handle, only a large, circular symbol etched into its surface, the same symbol she had seen in Thomas's notebook. Helen reached out to touch the door, but the moment her fingers brushed the cold metal, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She staggered backward, clutching her head as whispers filled her ears. "Leave. Now." The voices grew louder, overlapping until they were a cacophony of incomprehensible words. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on her chest and making it hard to breathe. "Enough," Helen shouted, her voice echoing through the basement. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Helen took a shaky breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't dare touch the door again, but she couldn't ignore the pull it had on her. That evening, Helen confronted Richard once more. "There's a door in the basement," she said. "What's behind it?" Richard's face turned ashen. "You went down there?" he asked, his voice filled with alarm. "Yes," Helen replied. "And I know you know what's behind that door." Richard shook his head vehemently. "You shouldn't have gone down there, Helen. That door, it's not meant to be opened." Why? What's behind it? Richard hesitated, his hands trembling. It's where Gregory and Thomas performed their rituals, he said finally. They thought they could summon something, bind it to their will. But they were wrong. It was never under their control. Helen's breath caught in her throat. What did they summon? Richard didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was enough to make her blood run cold. You need to leave this house, he said urgently, before it's too late. But Helen couldn't leave, not yet. She had come here for answers, and she wasn't going to stop until she uncovered the truth, no matter the cost. As night fell, Helen found herself drawn back to the basement. This time she came prepared. Armed with a crowbar, a lantern, and a notebook to record anything she found, she descended the stairs once more. The iron door loomed before her, its etched symbol seeming to glow faintly in the dim light. Helen's hands trembled as she raised the crowbar, wedging it into the seam of the door. It took all her strength to pry it open. The metal groaned in protest, but finally the door gave way, revealing a dark, narrow passage beyond. The air that wafted out was thick and stifling, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Helen hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, her lantern casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. The passage led to a circular chamber at the heart of the basement. In the center of the room was a stone altar, its surface stained with dark, rust-colored marks. Surrounding the altar were the same symbols from Thomas's notebook, carved into the floor and walls. Helen's stomach turned as she realized what she was looking at, a ritual site. Before she could take another step, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. And then, from the shadows, the whispers began again. This time, they weren't just voices. They were screams. Helen froze in the pitch-black chamber, her heart hammering in her chest. The oppressive darkness seemed alive, pulsating around her as the whispers grew louder. She fumbled for the lantern, her trembling fingers struggling to relight it. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, though her voice was barely audible over the eerie murmurs that surrounded her. The lantern flared back to life, casting its weak glow across the chamber. For a brief moment, Helen thought she was alone, but then she saw them, shadows that didn't belong to anything in the room. They clung to the walls, shifting and writhing as though alive. As she stared, they seemed to grow, stretching out towards her with claw-like tendrils. Helen. Her name echoed through the chamber, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. She whipped around, the lantern shaking in her hand. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. No answer came, only the sound of heavy breathing that wasn't her own. The shadows began to coalesce, forming a dark figure at the edge of the room. It was humanoid in shape but utterly featureless, its form made entirely of shifting black mist. Helen took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "Leave," the figure hissed, its voice like the scrape of metal on stone. "This is not your place." "I'm not leaving until I know the truth," Helen said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "What happened in this house? What did Gregory and Thomas do here?" The figure seemed to hesitate, its form flickering as though caught between existence and oblivion. "They opened the door," it said finally. "They invited us in." Helen's blood ran cold. "Us?" The figure moved closer, and Helen instinctively stepped back. "We are the shadows," it said. "The whispers in the dark. They called to us, thinking they could control us. But they were wrong. We are bound to this place now, waiting, watching. For what?" Helen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For the debt to be paid." Helen's mind raced. The debt. The warnings in Thomas's notebook. The missing wife. It all pointed to the same horrifying conclusion. "What is the debt?" she demanded, her voice rising. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it dissolved into the air, leaving Helen alone in the chamber. The whispers faded, and the oppressive darkness seemed to lift, but the sense of unease remained. Helen turned and ran back up the passage, her lantern swinging wildly. She didn't stop until she was back in the basement, gasping for air. She needed answers, and she knew there was only one person who could give them to her. That night, Helen confronted Richard again. She found him in the sitting room, nursing a glass of whiskey by the fire. He looked up as she entered, his expression wary. "I went into the basement," Helen said without preamble. "I opened the door." Richard's face paled. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice shaking. "I saw them," Helen continued, ignoring his warning. "The shadows. They told me about the debt." "What does it mean, Richard? What did Gregory and Thomas do?" Richard drained his glass and set it down with a trembling hand. "They made a pact," he said finally. "They were desperate. Gregory wanted power, and Thomas wanted knowledge. They thought they could summon something that would give them what they wanted. And the debt? They didn't realize the cost," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The entity they summoned, whatever it was, it demanded a price. Gregory's wife was the first. Thomas was the second." Helen's stomach turned. "And now it's waiting for more." Richard nodded. "It's bound to the house. As long as the house stands, it will keep taking." "Then why hasn't it taken you?" Helen asked. Richard looked away, his expression pained. "Because I've spent my life avoiding it. I don't sleep in the house. I don't go near the basement. I don't stay longer than I have to." Helen's mind raced. If what Richard said was true, then staying in the mansion was a death sentence. But she couldn't leave, not yet. Not until she knew how to stop whatever was happening. As the night wore on, Helen returned to the library, determined to find a way to end the cycle. She pored over Thomas's notebook again, searching for anything she might have missed. It was then that she noticed a passage she hadn't seen before, scrawled in the margin of one of the pages. "The fire is the key. Only the fire can cleanse the house of its sins." Helen's heart skipped a beat. She remembered Thomas's warning about the mansion burning. Had he known all along that the only way to stop the entity was to destroy the house? The thought filled her with dread, but she knew it was the only way. The mansion had become a prison for the shadows, and as long as it stood, they would continue to claim their victims. But destroying the house wouldn't be easy, and Helen had a sinking feeling that the shadows wouldn't let her go without a fight.